Kamala Harris sat in her seat, the hum of the plane's engines the only sound that filled the cabin. The air was thick with the low chatter of passengers, the soft rustle of newspapers, and the occasional clink of a seatbelt fastened. As the plane ascended into the sky, Kamala settled back, her mind focused on the political meeting awaiting her at her destination. It was a routine flight, the kind she had taken countless times before. For her, this was simply another step in her long journey of service, another moment of reflection in the midst of the whirlwind of public life. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by as the world below grew smaller. But as she relaxed, Kamala noticed something. A subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't an immediate change, but something in the air, a growing discomfort that she couldn't quite place. It was the flight attendant. The woman had passed by several times already, but this time her gaze lingered a moment too long, her eyes narrowing with an unmistakable expression of judgment. Kamala, ever the diplomat, kept her composure. She smiled politely as the flight attendant approached, but the interaction that followed would set the course for what was to come. The attendant's demeanor shifted. "Can I get you something to drink, Senator?" Her voice was clipped, formal, almost too formal. Kamala nodded, sensing the tension but choosing to ignore it. "Water, please," she replied with a warm smile. The attendant nodded curtly and moved on, but Kamala could feel the gaze of the woman burning on her back as she walked away. Something wasn't right, and Kamala's instincts told her that this wasn't just a passing discomfort. She glanced around the cabin, noticing a few passengers glancing in her direction, though no one made eye contact. It was subtle, but there was a shift in the energy. The sense of unease was growing. Moments later, the attendant returned, this time with a drink in hand. Kamala accepted it, her fingers brushing against the woman's for a brief moment. The flight attendant's grip tightened, just a bit too forcefully, as she handed over the water. Kamala's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw it, anger, barely restrained, simmering just beneath the surface. "Thank you," Kamala said, trying to break the tension with a polite smile. The attendant didn't respond right away. She simply stood there, staring at Kamala with something darker in her eyes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. "You people think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" The words came out like venom, cutting through the calm of the flight. Kamala's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained calm. She understood exactly what was happening now. This wasn't about a simple mix-up or misunderstanding. This was personal. The flight attendant wasn't just upset with Kamala as a passenger. She was upset with her as a political figure, as a woman of power. Kamala's hand tightened around the glass of water, her mind quickly processing the situation. The flight attendant's attitude had gone from cold to hostile in an instant, and she wasn't done. Kamala could see the flicker of something else in the woman's eyes now, resentment, maybe even hatred. The kind of emotion that, when left unchecked, could turn dangerous. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Kamala said, her voice steady but firm, her gaze unwavering. "Is there something wrong?" The flight attendant leaned in, her face too close, her breath hot on Kamala's face. "You think you're better than everyone. You think your position makes you untouchable. You think you can go around telling people what to do, changing the world. Well, I'm not going to let you get away with it." Kamala's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. She had been in far worse situations before, faced much more dangerous threats with grace and poise. But this was different. This wasn't just a political challenge, it was personal. It was a direct attack on her as a person, as a representative of everything the flight attendant clearly despised. Kamala's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I don't want any trouble," Kamala said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was strength in it. She wasn't backing down. "I don't want to fight." The flight attendant's lips curled into a thin smile. "Well, too bad. I'm going to make you fight." Without warning, the flight attendant turned and stormed off, her steps heavy, her mood dark. Kamala sat frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over her. This wasn't just a random outburst. Kamala had dealt with people who disagreed with her policies, people who tried to tear her down with their words, but this felt different. This was more than just prejudice. This was an attack, and it was personal. Kamala quickly scanned the cabin, her eyes sharp. She needed to stay aware, stay on guard. She couldn't let this escalate any further. There were too many lives on this plane for her to allow herself to be distracted by a personal vendetta. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The flight attendant's earlier hostility had spread through the cabin like a silent contagion. Kamala could feel the tension in the air, the passengers' uneasy glances as they tried to ignore the growing discomfort. It wasn't just the flight attendant now, it was everyone. Kamala could sense the change, the weight of the room shifting, and she knew she had to act quickly. She stood, moving down the aisle, her eyes scanning for the flight attendant. She had to confront this, not just for her own safety, but for the safety of everyone on the plane. This was no longer just about her reputation or political standing. This was about the safety of everyone aboard, the security of the flight itself, and the terrifying possibility that the flight attendant's actions could escalate into something far worse. The attendant was at the back of the plane now, speaking with one of the other flight crew members. Kamala could see the tension between them. They were arguing, though Kamala couldn't make out the words. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. Kamala approached cautiously, her steps measured. She couldn't show fear, not now, not ever. She needed to be in control, to take charge of the situation. If she didn't, the plane could fall into chaos, and it would be too late to do anything about it. But as she got closer, something shifted. The flight attendant glanced up, meeting Kamala's gaze, and for a brief moment, Kamala saw it, the flicker of something darker, something more dangerous in the woman's eyes. The smile that followed wasn't the smile of a person in control. It was the smile of someone who had just taken a step too far. Kamala realized then, with chilling clarity, that this was only the beginning. The moment Kamala Harris turned the corner into the rear of the plane, she was met with a chilling silence. The hum of the engines outside had been replaced by a tense stillness that seemed to hang in the air. The flight attendants, usually calm and efficient, were now acting strange. They exchanged uneasy glances, avoiding her gaze as she walked down the narrow aisle. Kamala's mind raced, her instincts kicking in. She had been in high-stress situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just an isolated incident of prejudice, it was something much darker, something that threatened the safety of everyone aboard. The flight attendant she had encountered earlier stood at the back of the plane, speaking with a senior crew member. The two were in a heated argument, though Kamala couldn't hear their words over the thrum of the engines. But the body language was unmistakable. The flight attendant was visibly agitated, her movements sharp and erratic, while the senior crew member appeared alarmed, trying to reason with her. Kamala knew she had to act fast. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated further. Kamala approached them, her steps deliberate, confident. As she neared the two, the flight attendant caught her eye and froze, her face momentarily flushing with something between guilt and defiance. The senior crew member's eyes darted between Kamala and the flight attendant, as though unsure whether to speak or keep silent. Kamala stood tall, her gaze locked onto the flight attendant, who was now visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "What's going on here?" Kamala's voice was calm but firm. There was no room for hesitation. This wasn't a situation that could be ignored. The stakes were too high. The senior crew member cleared his throat, glancing nervously at the flight attendant. "Everything's fine, Senator. Just a small issue we're working through," he said, his words stumbling over themselves. Kamala wasn't convinced. She could see the flight attendant's clenched fists, the tension in her posture. There was something far more dangerous brewing beneath the surface. The flight attendant's gaze shifted away from Kamala's, a flicker of something darker crossing her face. She wasn't done with Kamala, far from it. "You know what, Senator?" The flight attendant finally spoke, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't think you understand the reality of things. People like you get to go around making rules, making everyone follow your orders, but you're no different than the rest of us." Her words cut through the tension like a knife. Kamala's mind shifted into high gear. She didn't need to respond to the flight attendant's insults, not yet. What mattered now was figuring out what was really happening. Kamala could sense that this wasn't just personal resentment, it was something much larger. The way the attendant was speaking, the underlying anger in her voice, it hinted at something far more dangerous. Kamala had learned long ago that when people like this acted out, it was often the product of something far more insidious than mere prejudice. This was a threat, and she couldn't afford to underestimate it. "Is this about me?" Kamala asked, her voice steady. She could feel the tension rising again, but she remained composed. "Or is this about something bigger? Because right now, I'm trying to understand why a flight attendant is sabotaging the safety of this plane and threatening the passengers." The flight attendant's eyes flashed with a mix of fury and something else, fear maybe. For the first time, Kamala saw the cracks in her armor. The flight attendant didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step back, almost as though trying to regain some control over the situation. The senior crew member, clearly uncomfortable, tried to intervene. "Senator, please, this isn't the time or the place for this. We'll take care of it," he said, his voice wavering. Kamala didn't take her eyes off the flight attendant. "No, we won't take care of it," she said firmly, her voice rising just enough to show she wasn't backing down. "Not until I understand exactly what's going on here. This plane is in the sky, and right now, everyone on it is at risk because of one person's actions." The flight attendant's shoulders slumped, the anger briefly dissipating. She was no longer trying to conceal the truth. It was too late for that. Kamala had cornered her, and she could see the shift in the woman's demeanor. There was no more defiance in her eyes, only something far worse. The flight attendant stepped forward, her voice low and trembling now. "You don't get it, do you? I'm just a small part of this. There's a lot more going on here than you think. I wasn't supposed to do this, I didn't want to. But they promised me everything would change if I just followed the orders. They said you were the enemy?" She stopped herself, realizing she had said too much. Her eyes darted to the senior crew member, who seemed to be shrinking into the background. Kamala's mind raced. She had been right. This wasn't just an isolated attack, it was part of something bigger. The flight attendant wasn't just acting on her own resentment, she was a pawn in a much larger scheme, and Kamala was in the crosshairs. But why? What was the flight attendant being manipulated into doing? And who was behind this? "Who is they?" Kamala demanded, her tone sharp now, no longer playing the game. "Tell me. I need to know who's behind this." The flight attendant looked around nervously, as though considering whether she should continue. Kamala's patience was running out. "You're not just putting me at risk. You're putting every single person on this flight in danger. Now, who are you working for?" The attendant's lips quivered, her eyes darting to the other passengers, who were now starting to notice the growing tension. It was clear that Kamala's questioning had begun to stir a sense of unease in the cabin. The passengers weren't oblivious. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The flight attendant's eyes locked onto Kamala's with a mixture of fear and something else, a glimmer of understanding, as if she realized that this was no longer just about her. Kamala had stepped into a much larger game. "There's a group," the flight attendant whispered, barely audible. "A political group. They want you out. They want to destroy everything you've built. They said this would be the start. Make an example of you." She hesitated before continuing. "I was supposed to make sure you didn't make it to your meeting, but it's bigger than that. They've infiltrated the system, they're everywhere." Kamala's mind spun. A political conspiracy. The wheels of her mind began turning faster as she processed this new information. It wasn't just about a racist flight attendant with a personal grudge. This was an orchestrated attack, a coordinated effort to take her down, to cripple her ability to function in the political sphere. But why? What did they hope to achieve by bringing down Kamala Harris, and how far did this plot reach? Kamala's instincts were razor-sharp now. She had to act, and she had to act fast. This was no longer just a personal confrontation, it was a full-blown crisis, and the only way to stop it was to dismantle the conspiracy from the inside before it was too late. The weight of the flight attendant's confession hung in the air like a fog, clouding Kamala's thoughts. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was bigger than she anticipated, far bigger. A political group had orchestrated this attack, and they had somehow infiltrated the system, using people like this flight attendant as pawns in their game. Kamala's mind was already running through the possibilities. Who was behind it? What was their end goal? And, most importantly, how far did their influence spread? The flight attendant's trembling hands were the only sign of her remorse, but her eyes were still full of defiance. Kamala didn't have time to pity her. The lives of everyone on this plane were at risk, and every second she spent here was one more second the conspiracy could be advancing. Kamala's voice was steady, but her mind raced. "You're telling me this is bigger than just you, than just me," she said, stepping closer. "You're saying there's a group, a coordinated effort to stop me. How far does this go? Who's pulling the strings?" The flight attendant's eyes darted nervously, her breath quickening. She looked around the cabin again, as if the walls might close in on her. Kamala could see the fear, but also the struggle in her face. The woman had been caught between her personal biases and the political group's influence, and now she was caught in the web she had helped spin. It's all connected," the flight attendant muttered. "They told me to watch you, to make sure you don't make it. They want to discredit you, ruin everything you stand for. The people behind this, they have people everywhere, in every system, waiting for their moment. And I was supposed to be part of that moment. I was supposed to make sure you didn't reach your destination. If you did, it would be a setback." Kamala's blood ran cold. She hadn't expected this. This wasn't just about racism. This was a deliberate, planned attempt to take her down, to derail her entire political career. But who were these people, and how far did they reach? She had always been aware of the risks of public life, of the power struggles, but this was something more sinister. "I don't have time for this," Kamala said, her voice now hard and focused. "This isn't about personal animosity. This is about power, political power. Who's behind you? Who's behind all of this?" The flight attendant hesitated, her face contorting with the internal conflict. She seemed to be weighing the consequences of speaking further. Kamala's eyes were locked onto hers, unblinking, unyielding. She knew that if she didn't get the answers now, she might never have the chance. They're not just in politics. They've infiltrated everything. Media, corporations, the military, they've got their hands in everything. And the flight attendant's voice faltered, as if the weight of the situation finally hit her. "I was just a small part of it. But now that I've told you, I don't know what'll happen." Kamala processed the information quickly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. This was a vast network, one that stretched far beyond a single flight, beyond a single political figure. They were trying to destabilize the very fabric of the system. And if Kamala didn't act fast, they would succeed. Her gaze hardened, the resolve in her chest burning like a fire. She couldn't back down now. She had to expose this conspiracy before it was too late. Kamala had faced much bigger threats in her political career, attacks on her character, her policies, her very identity, but this was different. This was a battle not just for her survival, but for the future of everything she believed in. "Listen to me," Kamala said, her voice low but filled with authority. "I'm going to make sure this ends today. You might have been a pawn in their game, but you don't have to keep playing. You can help stop this. Help me take them down." The flight attendant's eyes flickered with doubt, but Kamala saw something else there, a flicker of hope. The woman was caught between fear and a desire to make things right. Kamala knew she couldn't afford to lose her. "I can't do this alone," Kamala continued, her voice steady and firm. "But I'll need your help. We can't let this conspiracy continue. We need to expose them, every last one of them. Do you want to be part of that change, or are you going to let them win?" The flight attendant's face softened, her shoulders dropping slightly. She was defeated, but not broken. She nodded slowly, as if making the hardest decision of her life. "I'll help you," she whispered, the weight of her decision settling in. "But you need to understand, this is going to be bigger than we think. They'll come after you, they'll stop at nothing to silence you." Kamala took a deep breath. She knew the risks. She knew the dangers. But she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. The stakes were too high, and the time for hesitation was over. "We exposed them, and we expose them now," Kamala said, her voice unwavering. "There's no more waiting. I'm taking this fight to the top, and I need you to help me get there." The flight attendant looked up, meeting Kamala's eyes for the first time with a clear understanding of what was at stake. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice trembling but filled with newfound conviction. "But you need to know, this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been silenced. It's about the people who've been kept in the dark." Kamala nodded, her mind already racing with plans. "Exactly," she said. "It's about all of us. And we're not going to let them win." In that moment, something shifted between them. The flight attendant had gone from being an enemy to an ally. She had stepped into the light, shedding the chains of manipulation that had bound her. Kamala could see it in her eyes. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She had found her purpose. Kamala turned and walked toward the cockpit, her mind already formulating a strategy. The time for subtlety was over. They were going to bring this conspiracy into the light, and nothing was going to stop them. She couldn't afford to hesitate. The future of everything she fought for was at risk. And Kamala Harris wasn't about to let that future slip away. The gravity of the situation hit Kamala as she made her way to the cockpit. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the lives on the plane pressing down on her. She could feel the flight attendant's eyes on her, the anxiety and guilt emanating from the woman as she followed behind. Kamala couldn't afford to waste time. The conspiracy was vast, and every second counted. They had to act quickly, or everything could unravel before they had a chance to stop it. When Kamala reached the cockpit, she found the two pilots seated, their eyes wide as they noticed her entrance. The usual calm professionalism in their faces was replaced by unease. Kamala didn't have time for pleasantries. She needed answers. "I need you to listen to me," Kamala said, her voice sharp and commanding. "There's a threat on this plane. A flight attendant has been compromised, and I need your cooperation to stop a potential disaster." The pilots exchanged uneasy glances, but neither spoke. Kamala could sense their hesitation. She needed to break through their reluctance. This wasn't about just one passenger. This was about saving the lives of everyone on board. "I don't have time to explain in full detail," Kamala continued, locking eyes with each pilot. "There's a political conspiracy at play, and this flight is part of a larger plan to destabilize key figures. We need to act now, or we risk everything." One of the pilots, the captain, opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. "What are you suggesting, Senator?" he asked cautiously, his tone wary. "We need to lock down the cabin," Kamala said firmly. "I need you to give me control of the situation. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. We're in the middle of a security breach, and we need to ground this plane immediately. Get the authorities involved, and let's secure the area." The captain blinked, clearly struggling to process the gravity of her words. Kamala could see the internal conflict waging behind his eyes, the disbelief and fear that threatened to cloud his judgment. But Kamala wasn't going to let this crisis derail them. She stepped forward, her presence filling the space. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make sure this plane lands safely," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is bigger than me. This is about every single person on this flight. We don't have time to waste." The second pilot, a woman with short, dark hair, finally spoke up, her voice tinged with the same sense of urgency. "What do you need from us?" she asked, her gaze hardening as she processed Kamala's words. Kamala nodded. "I need you to take control of the plane. Secure the cabin. We need to isolate any threats and figure out who's involved in this. We can't afford any more surprises." The captain looked at his co-pilot, and then back at Kamala. After a long pause, he nodded once, signaling his agreement. "All right, let's get this under control," he said, his voice more steady now. He turned to the second pilot and gave a quick command, instructing her to start coordinating with ground control. Kamala could see the shift in their demeanor. They had been hesitant, uncertain, but now they understood the gravity of the situation. They weren't just dealing with a personal dispute, they were in the middle of a crisis, and every decision they made now could mean the difference between life and death. As the pilots moved quickly to secure the plane, Kamala returned to the cabin. She was met with more nervous glances from the passengers, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. They didn't know what was happening yet, but Kamala could feel the ripple of fear spread through the cabin. She needed to calm them, to give them something to hold onto in the face of this chaos. "Everyone, please remain calm," Kamala said, her voice amplified through the intercom. "There's a situation aboard this flight that requires your cooperation. We are securing the cabin, and your safety is our top priority. Please remain in your seats and follow the instructions of the crew." Kamala watched as the passengers slowly began to settle, some still whispering in confusion, others staring at her with wide eyes. She could see the fear in their faces, but she also saw something else, a glimmer of hope, of trust. They were looking to her for guidance, and she couldn't afford to falter now. She needed to be the leader they all needed in this moment of crisis. The flight attendant who had initiated this chaos appeared at the back of the cabin, looking like a shadow of her former self. She was no longer the woman who had been filled with anger and defiance. Now, she looked like someone trapped in her own web of lies, unsure of how to get out. Kamala met her gaze and gave her a curt nod. The woman nodded back, her expression filled with shame and fear. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. Kamala knew that exposing this conspiracy would take more than just securing the cabin. She had to find out who was pulling the strings, who was orchestrating this elaborate plot to bring her down. She needed to get to the bottom of it before they could stop her. As the minutes ticked by, Kamala worked with the flight crew, organizing the passengers, making sure everyone remained seated, calm, and focused. The situation was far from over, but she had regained control. Her leadership had stabilized the situation, for now. But Kamala knew this was just the beginning. There were far more layers to this conspiracy than she had imagined, and she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. The minutes dragged on, the tension in the cabin thickening with every passing second. Kamala's mind was racing, formulating a plan, but her instincts told her that the hardest part was yet to come. They had taken control of the situation, but the real challenge was still ahead, finding out who was behind this, exposing their network, and making sure they didn't get away with it. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a battlefield, and Kamala Harris was prepared to fight. She wasn't going to let these people win. She wasn't going to let them destroy everything she had worked for. The plan was set in motion. Kamala was no longer just a passenger. She was in charge now. And nothing, no conspiracy, no sabotage, no threat, was going to stop her from ensuring this flight would land safely. But the true fight was only beginning, and Kamala Harris was ready to face it head-on. Kamala's heart raced as she made her way back to the cabin. The situation had taken a darker turn than she could have ever anticipated. The flight was no longer just about a flight attendant with a personal vendetta. It was about a coordinated political conspiracy, one that reached deep into the power structures of the country. She had to expose it, and she had to do it fast. Time was not on her side. The passengers sat quietly in their seats, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Kamala knew that panic could spread in an instant, and she couldn't afford that. She moved to the front of the cabin, her eyes scanning the room. The flight attendants were working to secure the passengers, but the air was thick with tension. Kamala needed to act. She had to take this situation and turn it into an opportunity to take back control, not just of the plane, but of the narrative. She turned to the flight attendant who had started this whole ordeal. The woman was standing by the galley, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. Kamala could see the guilt in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a flicker of fear, of realization. Kamala approached her, her voice calm, but firm. "I need you to tell me everything," Kamala said, her tone unwavering. "What was your role in this? What do you know about this conspiracy?" The flight attendant's hands trembled as she wiped her forehead. I didn't mean for this to happen," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "They told me to make sure you didn't make it to your meeting. To sabotage the flight. I didn't know how far they would go. I thought I could back out, but they threatened me. They knew everything about me, my family, my past." Kamala took a deep breath. The flight attendant was clearly conflicted, caught in a web of manipulation. But now wasn't the time for sympathy. Kamala needed the truth. "Who are they?" Kamala demanded. "Who is behind this?" The woman looked around, fear evident in her eyes. I don't know their names. But they've got people everywhere. They've got power in the media, the government, corporations. It's bigger than any one person. It's a network, and they've been planning this for months. You were their target, Senator. They wanted you gone." Kamala's mind raced. A political network? She'd suspected there were forces out there trying to undermine her, but this was bigger than she'd imagined. The flight attendant was a small part of something much more sinister, and Kamala knew that if she didn't act now, the repercussions could be catastrophic, not just for her, but for the entire country. "I need to know everything," Kamala said again, this time with more urgency in her voice. "Where are they? How far does this go? Who's pulling the strings?" The flight attendant swallowed hard, but she was too far gone to turn back. They said you were a symbol of what they couldn't control. They had to take you down, Senator. If they didn't, you'd disrupt their plans. They've got people in every major institution, in the highest levels of power. They said you wouldn't make it through this flight." Kamala's blood ran cold. She'd been targeted, but the question remained, why? What was it about her policies, that made her such a threat to this shadow network? And who were these people who had the power to control and manipulate on such a massive scale? Kamala had always known there were forces working against her, but this was a revelation of an entirely different magnitude. This wasn't just about politics. This was about survival. The flight attendant's confession gave Kamala a piece of the puzzle, but the bigger picture was still hidden. She couldn't rely on the flight attendant alone for the answers. She needed to find the source, the ones who were orchestrating this entire plot. Kamala's thoughts shifted into overdrive. This conspiracy wasn't just about taking her down, it was about power, control, and the manipulation of systems that were supposed to protect people. They had chosen her as a target, but they didn't care about her specifically. She was just a means to an end, a symbol of everything they wanted to destroy. Kamala turned and walked toward the cockpit. Her mind was sharp, her resolve solid. The crisis wasn't over, but she wasn't going to let these people win. She wasn't going to let fear and manipulation dictate her future. She had a job to do, and that job was bigger than herself. It was about everything she had worked for, the values she believed in, and the future she was trying to build for the country. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The door to the cockpit opened, and Kamala stepped inside, her voice steady as she addressed the pilots. "We're being targeted by a coordinated political conspiracy. It's bigger than anything we imagine. I need you to get in touch with ground control. I need to bring this to light before it's too late." The pilots exchanged a quick glance before nodding. Kamala's tone was unwavering, and they could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't asking for their help, she was demanding it. Kamala wasn't going to let this crisis slip through her fingers. The situation was dangerous, but she was the one in control now. "Do it," Kamala said firmly. "We need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more lives are at risk. I don't care about politics right now. I care about getting to the truth." The captain nodded again, his face now set with resolve. "Understood, Senator. We're with you." Kamala felt a surge of relief, but there was no time to dwell on it. There was a far bigger fight ahead. The conspiracy had to be exposed, and she had to make sure it didn't get away with everything it had planned. As the pilots worked quickly to contact ground control, Kamala stood still, her mind already working on the next step. She had learned the hard way that when faced with a crisis of this magnitude, hesitation could be deadly. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. The flight might have been grounded, but the real battle was still ahead, and Kamala Harris wasn't about to back down. She wasn't about to let these shadowy figures win. Not now. Not ever. Her resolve was clear. This wasn't just a fight for her future. This was a fight for the future of the country, for justice, and for everything that was worth protecting. Kamala Harris was in control, and she was going to make sure the truth came out, no matter what it took. Kamala stood at the front of the cabin, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had taken control of the plane, but the real battle had only just begun. The conspiracy she had uncovered was far larger than anything she had imagined, and now, she needed to find a way to expose it. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the truth, for justice, and for the safety of every single person on board. As the pilots made contact with ground control, Kamala's thoughts raced. She knew the system was compromised. She knew the stakes were higher than ever before. But she also knew that this was her moment, the moment to confront the people who thought they could destroy everything she had worked for, the moment to stand up against those who tried to manipulate and control her. Kamala's mind kept returning to the flight attendant's words. They've got people everywhere. The conspiracy was vast, deeply embedded in systems of power. The network had infiltrated the highest levels of government, media, and business. This was no longer about a personal vendetta. This was a battle to expose the corrupt forces trying to manipulate the country's political landscape. Kamala had known that power structures often worked in the shadows, but she had never fully grasped the extent of that manipulation. Now, she had to break through that darkness and bring everything into the light. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice came through, calm but filled with urgency. Senator Harris, we've established contact with ground control. They're preparing for emergency response, but we need to keep this plane secure until we land. Kamala's pulse quickened. This was it. The plan was in motion, but there was no guarantee that they wouldn't face interference before landing. The people behind this conspiracy were well organized, and they weren't going to let her expose them without a fight. She glanced around the cabin. The passengers, some still unaware of the full extent of the situation, were nervous but listening to the crew's instructions. Kamala knew the crew had their hands full trying to maintain order. But the real challenge lay ahead. The conspiracy wasn't going to let them take control so easily. Kamala had to be prepared for whatever came next. She could feel it, this was just the beginning. Kamala moved through the cabin, her eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. She had to make sure everyone stayed calm. If the situation turned into chaos, there was no telling how far the conspirators would go to cover their tracks. She stopped near the back of the cabin, where the flight attendant who had started this whole mess stood, her posture deflated, her eyes on the floor. You did the right thing by telling me, Kamala said quietly, her voice steady. But you're not off the hook yet. There's still more we need to uncover, and you're going to help me get there. The flight attendant nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would go this far. I thought it was just about you. But now I see it's much bigger. They'll stop at nothing to silence you. They've got people everywhere, even in the government. People who have already infiltrated key positions. Kamala's heart sank. The flight attendant's words confirmed what Kamala had feared. The conspiracy wasn't just trying to take her down. They were trying to destabilize the entire system, to infiltrate the very institutions that were meant to protect the public. This wasn't just a fight for her career, it was a fight for democracy itself. I know, Kamala said, her voice cold with determination. And I'm going to make sure they don't win. She turned back toward the front of the cabin, her mind racing. The pieces were coming together, but the picture wasn't complete yet. She needed to know who was pulling the strings, who was at the top of this vast, shadowy network. She had her suspicions, but there were too many unknowns. Kamala's focus shifted to the cockpit. She had to make sure the pilots were ready for the landing. The ground response was already in motion, but there was still the threat that the conspirators might try to disrupt their efforts. The moment they landed, Kamala would need to be prepared to act fast. The fight wasn't over until she had the answers and the people responsible were exposed. "Get ready," Kamala said into the intercom, her voice loud and clear. "Once we land, we need to move fast. We can't let them cover their tracks. We need to get this out into the open before they can stop us." As the plane began its descent, Kamala's mind raced. The stakes were higher than ever before. The ground response was in motion, but there was no guarantee that the conspirators wouldn't interfere. She had to be ready for whatever came next. The plane touched down, the wheels screeching against the runway. Kamala felt the tension in the air, the uncertainty of what would happen next. The ground crew was waiting, but Kamala knew they couldn't afford to trust anyone without verifying their loyalty. She wasn't going to let this conspiracy go unchecked. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Kamala was led off the plane by ground control, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of interference. She could feel the weight of the situation on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. She had to expose the conspiracy before it could do any more damage. As she walked toward the security area, Kamala's phone buzzed. She checked the screen and saw a message from one of her trusted allies in the government. "We're in," it read. "We've got the names. It's bigger than you think." Kamala's stomach churned. She had suspected this was the case, but now she had confirmation. The conspiracy went all the way to the top. The people behind this plot were more powerful than she had imagined. But Kamala wasn't going to back down. She had come too far. She wasn't going to let them win. "We're going to make sure this all comes to light," Kamala muttered under her breath, her voice filled with conviction. "We'll make sure they don't get away with it." She turned to face the ground team, her mind focused. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. Kamala Harris wasn't going to stop until the truth was exposed, and until the people who thought they could manipulate the system were brought to justice. She had just begun to fight, and she wasn't going to stop until the conspiracy was shattered. Kamala stood in the midst of the chaos, the weight of the situation settling in. The truth was finally within her reach, but she knew the battle was far from over. The conspiracy that had threatened not just her life, but the lives of everyone on the plane, was vast, and its roots ran deep. It wasn't just a personal attack. This was about power, control, and the manipulation of entire systems. The stakes were higher than ever before, but Kamala had no intention of letting the forces behind this conspiracy get away with it. She was committed now, not just to her own survival, but to the survival of the democratic process itself. As she moved through the security perimeter, Kamala's mind was focused, her thoughts sharp. The conspiracy had revealed itself to be a well-orchestrated effort to dismantle the very structures that protected the rights of the people. They had used manipulation, fear, and sabotage to try to take her down. But Kamala wasn't going to let them succeed. She had exposed a piece of the network, but there was still much to uncover. The ground response had begun, but she knew the next steps were crucial. She couldn't afford to lose momentum. Kamala glanced around at the officers and agents who were waiting for her. She had to trust them, but she also knew better than to assume that everyone was on her side. In a situation like this, loyalty could be easily bought or manipulated. The conspiracy had infiltrated every level of society, and she wasn't sure who she could trust. But she had no choice. She had to press forward. "We need to move quickly," Kamala said, her voice firm. "There's no time to waste. The conspiracy's too big, and we need to take it down now. If we don't, they'll disappear into the shadows, and it will be too late." The officers nodded, their expressions grave. They understood the gravity of the situation, and they were ready to act. Kamala's plan was clear: expose the conspiracy, identify those behind it, and dismantle it before it could do any more damage. But the challenge was massive. The conspiracy wasn't just about taking down one person, it was about taking down an entire system that had been rigged for years. As Kamala continued to speak with the ground team, her thoughts turned back to the flight attendant who had revealed the conspiracy to her. The woman had been a pawn, manipulated and threatened into compliance. Kamala knew that her willingness to speak out was a sign that there was still hope. There was still the possibility for redemption, for the chance to make things right. Kamala didn't just see the flight attendant as a traitor, she saw someone who had been broken by a system designed to control and silence. And in Kamala, that flight attendant had found a voice. Kamala's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen and saw a new message from her trusted ally in government. The message was short but impactful. We've identified key players. They're in positions of power. The network is deeper than we thought. Kamala's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The names had come through. She now knew who was behind the conspiracy, and the truth was even more disturbing than she had imagined. The network had infiltrated the highest levels of government, corporate power, and the media. These were the people who had been pulling the strings all along, orchestrating a plan to take her down and silence anyone who stood in their way. Kamala looked up, her mind racing. The conspiracy wasn't just a threat to her, it was a threat to the integrity of the nation. The people behind it were willing to do whatever it took to manipulate the system and maintain their power. Kamala knew that the fight was bigger than herself. It was about protecting the future of the country, about defending the values she had sworn to uphold. She turned to the officers and agents standing by. We've got the names. But this is far from over. The people behind this conspiracy are entrenched in the system. They've built a network that's too vast to take down in one go. But we can't wait. We need to act now. The officers nodded again, more determined now. They understood the weight of what they were facing. Kamala wasn't just leading a fight for herself. She was leading a fight for the soul of the nation. If she couldn't stop this conspiracy, if she couldn't expose the people behind it, everything she had worked for would be in jeopardy. We're going to move fast, Kamala continued. The moment we expose them, we'll be up against everything they have. But we can't back down. Not now. She stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her heart was pounding, but she could feel the surge of determination building inside her. This was the moment of truth, the moment that would define her legacy. Kamala Harris wasn't just a political figure. She was a symbol of resilience, of leadership in the face of adversity. She wasn't going to let these people win. She wasn't going to let them silence her or anyone else. We're not just fighting for my future, Kamala said, her voice now resonating with power. We're fighting for the future of this country. For every person who believes in justice, in equality, in truth. This conspiracy may have thought they could manipulate the system, but they're wrong. We're going to expose them, and we're going to make sure they never do this again. The officers responded with a unified nod, their faces set in grim determination. Kamala knew she had the support she needed, but the next steps would be crucial. The conspiracy had deep roots, but Kamala was going to pull those roots out, one by one. The time for hesitation had passed. This was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As Kamala turned to face the crowd of officers and agents, she felt the full weight of what she was about to undertake. The fight was only beginning, and the enemies she faced were powerful and ruthless. But she was ready. Kamala Harris was no longer just a target. She was the leader who would take the fight to those who thought they could control the future. She would expose them, break their grip on power, and restore the integrity of the systems they had tried to corrupt. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Kamala Harris was ready to lead the charge. She was ready to take down the conspiracy and make sure it never threatened the future again. The truth would come out, and when it did, the world would know who stood in the way of those who tried to manipulate it. Kamala Harris. And she was just getting started.